The sun hung low over the dusty horizon, casting a golden haze across the wide, open land. The wind moved slow through the tall grass, whispering secrets too old to understand. And at the edge of the little town of Willow Junction, just beyond the mercantile and the church with the leaning steeple, the train station sat quiet, except for the woman on the bench. She had been there for 3 days. Her name was Clara Bell, and her dress, though once pressed and proper, now held creases from sleep and the thin layer of dust carried by the prairie wind. Her hair had started to loosen from its careful bun, and her gloved hands rested in her lap over a small suitcase, one with worn leather corners and the initials C.B. faintly scratched into the side. She was supposed to be married by now. The ad had been clear. Widower seeks wife. Must be of strong character and good heart. Ranch in need of a lady's touch. Room and future provided. Clara had responded with care, with trembling hope. Letters had followed. Promises. Even a ring sent in the mail. But when the train pulled into Willow Junction, no one had come to meet her. Not on the first day. Not on the second. Not today. Across the street, the local sheriff had passed by twice without stopping. The station master, a wiry man with a sunburned neck, offered her lukewarm coffee on the second morning, then resumed his work as if she were part of the bench. And from behind the stable, leaning in the shadow of a post, a cowboy watched. He didn't speak. He didn't stare. But he noticed the way her hands fidgeted with the ribbon on her hat, the way she stood every time the afternoon train rumbled in, only to sit back down when the last passenger disembarked. He hadn't meant to listen when the women at the general store whispered. Mail-order bride, poor thing. Man probably backed out or got himself killed, or worse. Shouldn't be out here alone. This land eats women like her. He didn't join in. He simply listened. And on the third evening, as the sun dipped behind the station, he walked across the dirt road and stopped in front of her. She looked up slowly, blinking into the sun behind his shoulder. His face was shaded by the brim of his hat, but his eyes, blue, steady, unreadable, met hers without a flinch. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, voice low and rough from disuse. Clara swallowed. "I was." He said nothing for a moment. Just let the wind fill the space between them. Then, "Train don't come again till Friday." She nodded. "I know." He looked at her suitcase, then back to her. "You got a place to sleep?" She hesitated. "I was told he had a house out east of here, with a porch and a chimney. I brought the address, but no one in town's heard of him." The cowboy shifted his weight. "That man's name wouldn't be Everett Lang, would it?" Clara's breath caught. "Yes." He exhaled through his nose. "Lang died last month. Kicked in the chest by a horse. I helped bury him." The words settled like dust between them. Clara blinked quickly, once, twice, but she didn't cry. "I see," she whispered. He nodded. "Didn't know he was sending letters." Clara looked away. "Apparently I didn't know much either." The cowboy cleared his throat, then tipped his hat back slightly. "Name's Elijah Boone," he said. "I've got a small place up north. Not much, but it's clean. You shouldn't be sleeping on benches out here." She met his eyes again. This time something else was there. Weariness, yes, but also the beginning of something more dangerous. Trust. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You won't be," he answered. "Just someone with a story, same as me." That night, Clara didn't sleep on the bench. She rode behind Elijah Boone on a quiet horse named Dusty, past the edge of the town, beyond the map of everything she thought her life would be. And somewhere in the silence between hoofbeats, she let herself hope. Not for love. Not yet. But for safety. For a place to rest. For a door that opened when she knocked. The trail north was long and quiet. Clara didn't speak much as the horse moved beneath them. Nor did Elijah. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was respectful. Like two people learning to breathe in the same space after a storm. The sun had set by the time they reached his homestead, a modest structure nestled in a hollow between two low ridgelines. The house was plain, its wood grayed from years of wind and weather, but it stood firm. Smoke curled from the chimney, steady and clean. He helped her down without a word, his hand warm beneath hers. "You'll be wanting rest," he said, leading her inside. The cabin was small, just one room and a loft. There was a bed in the corner, a stone fireplace, a table with only one chair, and shelves built into the walls lined with tin cups and worn books. Clara took it in quietly. "It's tidy," she offered. "It's honest," he replied. He motioned to the bed. "You take it tonight. I'll sleep outside. I've done it before." She shook her head. "Absolutely not." He didn't argue, just nodded once and said, "Then I'll take the loft." She placed her small suitcase beside the bed and turned toward the hearth. "May I heat water?" He stepped forward and handed her a kettle. "There's well water just outside the back." I'll bring it in." By the time she'd removed her gloves and bonnet, the kettle was over the fire, and Elijah was gone to tend the horse. Clara sat down at the edge of the bed, folding her hands in her lap. She had come all this way to marry a man who was now 6 feet under, and yet here she was, in a cabin owned by a stranger who hadn't asked anything of her, who hadn't made promises, who hadn't tried to fill the silence with words that didn't belong. Just a bed, a roof, and the kind of quiet that didn't push her away. That night, Clara lay under a patchwork quilt that smelled of cedar and soap. The fire crackled gently. Above her, in the loft, she could hear Elijah shifting once or twice, but otherwise, the house was still. She stared at the wooden beams overhead and tried to remember what her voice used to sound like when it was full of certainty. When she closed her eyes, it wasn't Everett Lang she saw anymore. It was the way Elijah Boone had looked at her. Steady, without judgment, without need, just seen. Upstairs, Elijah lay staring through the gap in the loft railing at the faint glow of the firelight below. He hadn't meant to bring her home, hadn't meant to care. But something about the way she had sat alone at the station for 3 days had pulled at a part of him long buried. Something old, something decent, something he didn't want her to think she owed him anything. But he also didn't want her to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose. Don't go getting foolish now, Boone. But it was already too late. The next morning broke cold and clear. Frost edged the windows in delicate veins, and the smell of ash and earth lingered from the fire long burned down. Clara was already awake. She stood near the hearth, sleeves rolled, hair tied back in a loose braid. A dented tin bowl sat on the table, flour dusting the wooden surface like snow. She kneaded dough quietly, methodically, her hands working like she'd done this her whole life. Elijah came down from the loft, boots in hand. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She didn't look up. "You gave me shelter. It seemed fair to offer bread." He said nothing more, only nodded and set his boots beside the door. He poured himself water from the jug, then paused as she placed the dough aside and wiped her hands. "Thank you," she said, turning to him. "For what?" "For not asking questions I wasn't ready to answer." He met her eyes. "You look like someone who's had enough questions." Clara nodded, "and not enough kindness." They worked side by side that day, not as friends, not yet, but as something new, co-inhabitants of a shared silence. Elijah mended a fence post out near the chicken yard. Clara swept out the cabin, boiled beans for dinner, and scrubbed the hearth until the stones shone. It wasn't about being useful. It was about staying upright. At midday, he returned with a wrapped bundle of supplies from town, flour, a spool of thread, and a new tin cup. Clara raised an eyebrow. "You didn't need to." He held it up. "Now we've got 2. A beat passed. Then she smiled. "You didn't trust me to share yours?" He gave a one-shouldered shrug. "Didn't figure you'd want to." That night, they ate quietly, the bread still warm between them. Clara cradled the new cup, feeling its weight. Elijah leaned back in his chair. "I can ride into Junction tomorrow. Send a wire to your people, if you've got kin." Clara hesitated. "I don't," she said finally. "My sister married East. We haven't spoken in years. My father died when I was 16. I had Everett, or thought I did, or thought." She looked down at her hands. "I was tired of waiting on something better, so I bought a train ticket and tried to build it myself." Elijah didn't respond for a while. Then, "Still reckon that was braver than most." She gave him a glance, half skeptical, half curious. "Even if it failed?" He shook his head, especially because of that. The fire popped, throwing shadows across the floor. Then he added, "I've known men who wouldn't walk to the next town for love, let alone cross a continent." That silenced her, not because it hurt, but because it healed something quietly. Before turning in, she stood in the doorway and looked out into the darkness. The prairie rolled into shadow, stars hanging low and close. Elijah came up beside her. "It's strange," she said. "What is?" "How you can come so far looking for a name, and instead you find a man who doesn't speak unless it's worth hearing." He turned toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "And a woman who speaks soft, but still carries thunder." That night, Clara slept without her boots near the bed. Not because she was staying, but because, for the first time in days, she wasn't preparing to run. The days stretched longer as spring pressed its way into the bones of the land. Snowmelt turned the trails to mud, and the trees along the creek began to bud. Small green promises on limbs that had seemed lifeless just weeks ago. Clara settled into Elijah's cabin like a soft song hummed beneath breath. She didn't claim anything. She didn't change much. But somehow, everything felt different. The blanket on the bed was folded tighter. The window above the basin stayed open just a crack, letting in air and bird song. And there was always bread now, always warmth, always something simmering on the stove. Elijah noticed things. The way Clara whispered to the chickens when she fed them. The way she stared into the fire when she thought he wasn't watching. Like she was still weighing something, still holding pieces of herself in both hands, unsure which to keep and which to lay down. And he noticed something else. He missed her when she stepped outside, even for 5 minutes, even when she came right back. One afternoon, after repairing the barn door and splitting 3 cords of wood, Elijah found her kneeling at the edge of the creek with her skirts pulled up to her calves, cold water rushing over her bare feet. She didn't hear him approach. "What are you doing?" he asked gently. She looked over her shoulder, smiling like someone caught mid-thought. "Making sure I still feel things." "You do," he said. She looked down. "Sometimes I don't trust it. This quiet. This waiting without fear. You think something bad's coming?" "I'm afraid something good won't stay." Elijah stepped beside her and crouched. The water was frigid, but his presence was steady, grounded. "I ain't much for promises," he said, "but I won't leave unless you ask me to." Clara's throat tightened. "Why would I ever do that?" "Because some folks can't let themselves be chosen." She didn't answer right away. Then, barely above the rush of water, she said, "I want to be." They walked back to the cabin in silence, and he didn't touch her. But she walked closer than before. And that night, when the wind howled, she didn't flinch. A week later, Elijah rode into town to trade for supplies. When he returned, he carried 2 things. A bag of dried strawberries, Clara's favorite, and a spool of soft blue fabric. She raised her brows when he set it on the table. "I don't sew much," she said. He shrugged. "Figured you'd want something of your own choosing. You don't have to explain what." She ran her hand over the fabric, her fingers lingering. "Elijah," she said softly. He looked up. "I wasn't waiting for Everett when you found me." "Not really." "No?" "I think I was waiting for someone to see me, without trying to fix me." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorway. "Then maybe we're both waiting on the same thing." That night, as Clara tucked the blue fabric into her case, still unopened since her arrival, she realized something strange. She hadn't thought about leaving all day. And for a woman who'd trained herself to map every exit, that meant everything. The next morning, Clara woke to bird song and the scent of fresh wood smoke curling beneath the door. Outside the cabin, the sun rose slow and honey-colored, touching the tops of the grass and making the dew glint like glass. She pulled her shawl over her shoulders and stepped onto the porch barefoot, blinking into the light. Elijah was already in the garden. He wasn't planting, not yet, but standing with his arms crossed, staring at the earth like he could will it to soften with just his presence. She walked quietly to stand beside him. "You always wake before the sun?" she asked. He didn't look away from the soil. "You learn to, when you've got no one to speak to but the ground." Clara folded her arms. "You don't strike me as a man bothered by silence." "I'm not." She tilted her head. "Then why let me fill it?" He looked at her then, the way he always did. Slowly, as if her presence was something to be absorbed, not measured. "Because when you speak, it sounds like something that matters." She flushed at that, real warm color rising to her cheeks. She looked away, not out of embarrassment, but because something about him always made her feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. "I don't always know what I'm doing here," she admitted. "You don't have to." "But you brought me in. You gave me your roof, and not once have you asked what I'll do next." "I figured that's yours to say, if it ever needs saying." She looked at him for a long moment. "I want to earn my keep." "You already have." "I want to do more." "Then stay," he said plainly. "Not as a guest, not out of pity, just stay." Clara's breath caught, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then she reached down, plucked a sprig of wild mint from the edge of the garden, and held it to her nose. "Then I'll plant something today," she whispered, "and we'll see if it grows." That afternoon they turned the soil together. Elijah showed her how to check the texture with her fingers, how to keep rows straight using twine and 2 pegs hammered into the dirt. Clara worked quietly, sweat at her temples, hands black with earth. She didn't complain. She didn't shrink from the labor. And Elijah, though still mostly silent, felt something soften inside him. Not the quiet, not the house, but the way she looked at him now. Like the silence between them wasn't emptiness, but space. Space to become something they didn't have to define yet. At supper, she placed a few of the wild mint leaves into a tin of boiling water. The smell filled the cabin, fresh, clean, familiar. "You cook like someone who never had the luxury of waste," Elijah said. She smiled gently. "That's because I didn't." He watched her stir the pot. "I've known women who cooked to impress. I cook to remember." "To remember what?" "That there's still sweetness left in the world," she said. even after it's boiled down. That night, after the dishes were dry and the coals glowed red in the hearth, Clara stood at the doorway and whispered, almost too soft for him to hear, "I think I was waiting for someone who didn't speak first." Elijah didn't move, but he said without turning, "And I was waiting for someone who didn't need me to." The next few weeks passed not in leaps, but in threads, quietly woven between chores and meals, between the morning light and the hush of the fire each evening. Spring deepened into itself, and so did they. Clara began stitching. The blue fabric Elijah had brought her sat folded for days until one morning she smoothed it across the table and started cutting without a word. A simple dress, no lace, no buttons of pearl, just something soft and strong, like she hoped she could be again. Elijah watched her from the porch one evening, one boot resting on the step, hands wrapped around a mug of hot chicory. He didn't ask what she was making. He didn't need to. Some things you just let become what they're meant to. It was Mary, the preacher's wife, who first knocked on the door. Clara answered with her sleeves rolled up and a dusting of flour on her cheek. She expected judgment, but Mary smiled wide. "I heard someone was baking bread out this way again." Clara blinked. "You heard?" "I've got ears, and your biscuits are better than rumors." Elijah appeared behind her, silent as always, nodding once. Mary set down a small parcel wrapped in cloth, candied pecans and a jar of honey. "For you," she said. "A trade." Clara hesitated. "You don't even know me." Mary raised an eyebrow. "I know a woman who stays when she could have run. That's enough." That night, Clara sat at the edge of the porch after supper, arms wrapped around her knees. Elijah joined her, boots thudding softly on the worn wood. "She gave us honey," Clara said, "like we're a we." He tilted his head. "Aren't we?" Clara didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, but because she wasn't sure how to name something that hadn't asked for a label. Something that didn't demand, but remained. "I still haven't unpacked my case," she admitted. "You don't have to. I think I'm afraid if I do, it means I can't leave." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe it means you don't want to." The night deepened around them. Crickets tuned up. The wind picked up the scent of wood smoke and mint. "Elijah," she said softly. He turned toward her. "If I crossed the threshold with both feet, would you call this mine too?" He didn't smile, not exactly. But something in his face warmed. "I already do." Later that night, after she washed up and braided her hair, Clara set the suitcase at the foot of the bed. She didn't open it yet, but she did rest her hand on it for a long time. And just before blowing out the lamp, she whispered into the darkness, "I'm not waiting anymore." In the loft above, Elijah lay still in his bedroll, staring at the ceiling. And for the first time in years, he closed his eyes and let himself dream of staying. The weather turned warmer. Longer days stretched lazily across the valley, and the sound of the creek deepened, full of melted snow from the hills. Clara began waking earlier, sometimes even before Elijah, and spent the cool hours tending the sprouting rows of beans and carrots they had planted side by side. Her hands were rougher now, her sleeves always dusty, but she carried herself taller. There was no mistaking it. She had stopped waiting to be rescued, and started building something instead. One morning, while rummaging through the drawer by the hearth looking for extra thread, Clara found a folded piece of parchment, yellowed at the edges. Curious, she opened it. It was a letter, unsent, to whomever she might have been. I was never good with words, but I thought maybe if I wrote it down first, I'd know what to say when you arrived. Maybe you'd come with a trunk, maybe just a name. Either way, I didn't want you to find a man with nothing to offer but silence and a broken fence. I've lived quiet a long time, lost things I never speak of. But if you came, and if you stayed, I wanted you to know. I built this place hoping someone might fill it. And if you left, I'd still be grateful you sat at the table once. The signature was missing, but it didn't need one. Clara held the letter for a long moment, the weight of it both heavier and kinder than she expected. When Elijah returned from the barn, she was sitting at the table, letter folded, her fingers resting on top. "You were going to send for someone," she said. He froze in the doorway, surprised but not ashamed. "I was," he said simply. "A long time ago." Clara looked up at him. "Why didn't you?" He leaned against the doorframe. "Didn't think I had anything to offer that would last." "And now?" He paused, then met her gaze. "Now I've got something worth staying for, whether she came by train or storm." That night, Clara placed the letter back where she'd found it. But this time, she slipped something next to it. A fresh sheet of paper, blank except for a single sentence written in her careful, steady hand. "I sat at your table, and I'm not leaving." The next morning, when Elijah found it, he didn't speak. He just held the note for a long time in both hands like something too delicate to fold. And when Clara entered with flour on her apron and her braid falling over one shoulder, he turned and smiled fully without hesitation for the very first time. The day Clara hung the blue dress on the clothesline, something shifted, not just in the wind, but in the space between her and Elijah. It wasn't the first time she'd washed it, nor the first time he'd seen it. But this time, it was dry and clean and gently swaying in the warm breeze, lit by the sun and framed by a sky too wide to measure. And it was hers, not borrowed, not sent for, not sewn in hope of impressing a stranger. It was sewn slowly, patiently, in a house that had never demanded anything from her but presence. Elijah passed by on his way from the barn, paused, and looked at it with a faint crease in his brow. Clara, noticing, wiped her hands and came to stand beside him. "You like it?" she asked. He didn't speak right away, then simply, "It looks like you." She smiled, soft and real. "It is me." She didn't wear it that day, or the next, but on Sunday morning, she stepped onto the porch with her hair pinned up and the blue dress falling past her boots. And Elijah, already saddling the horses, forgot what he was doing for half a second. Clara noticed and blushed, but she didn't shrink. She stood tall, arms loose at her sides, letting him see her, not just dressed, but present, chosen, choosing. Elijah walked toward her, slow and deliberate. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. He just said, "You ready?" Clara nodded, "As I'll ever be." They rode to Willow Junction together. This time she wasn't waiting on a bench. She wasn't scanning the platform for someone who'd never arrive. She wasn't trembling, wasn't hoping anyone would save her. This time she was the one who arrived. People stared, of course. The same townsfolk who had once whispered now nodded respectfully. Mary from the mercantile waved from the porch, her husband tipping his hat. Children pointed and grinned. "And Clara?" She smiled, because she knew now, whispers only carry weight if you let them. At the general store, Elijah picked up seed packets and a new pair of work gloves. Clara bought lavender soap and a tin of lemon drops for the children who sometimes wandered past their fence. At the counter, the clerk, a kind-faced man named Sam, glanced between them and asked gently, "You two finally making it official?" Clara paused, glancing toward Elijah. Elijah simply said, "Not yet," then added, "But it's coming." And when Clara looked back at Sam, she smiled. "Yes," she said, "it is." That evening, back at the cabin, Clara stood at the doorway in the blue dress as the sun fell behind the hills. Elijah stood a few feet away, rubbing the back of his neck, suddenly unsure again. "I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous habit," she replied, a grin teasing at the corner of her lips. He stepped closer. "I don't have much." She tilted her head. "You've said that before. But I've got land, and hands that work, and I've got room in this house for more than just silence." Clara stepped even closer. "I've got hands too," she said, "and stories, and a heart that's still learning how to stay soft." He looked at her, the dress catching the last light. "I want you here, Clara," he said. "Not just in the room, not just in spring." She reached up and touched his jaw, light as breath. "Then stop saying it like you're asking permission." He stilled. She smiled. "I'm not going anywhere, Elijah." That night the blue dress hung again, but not on the line, on the hook beside his coat, where it belonged. The next morning Clara woke before the sun. The cabin was still, quiet, warm from the coals in the hearth and the slow, steady heat of someone who no longer lived alone. She lay still for a moment, listening, not just to the wind outside or the birds tuning their voices in the trees, but to the gentle sound of peace inside her own chest. She rose, dressed quietly, and padded barefoot to the kitchen. The blue dress hung where she'd left it, on the hook beside Elijah's coat, and beside it, folded neatly on the table, was a note in his handwriting. It wasn't long. "Gone to mend the north fence. Left coffee warm on the stove. Don't do all the work without me. E." She smiled as she traced the words. The rest of the day was simple in the way only something hard-earned can be. Clara aired out the quilts, pulled the first early carrots from the garden, and reread one of the books Elijah kept stacked beside the hearth. She had grown to love the way his margins were filled with faint, penciled thoughts, not grand ideas, just observations. "This part's true. Reminds me of the creek bend. Saw a bird like this once." She wasn't just living in his house. She was starting to live in his mind. When he returned in the late afternoon, shirt damp with sweat and hands scratched from wire, she met him at the porch steps with a clean towel and a plate of cornbread wrapped in cloth. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she replied, "but I wanted to." They sat together under the awning, watching the light shift across the hills. He ate slowly, She didn't press him with talk. After a while, he said, "You make this place feel different." She looked over at him. "Different how?" "Like it's breathing again." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "It never stopped. You just didn't notice." Elijah turned his gaze to her, his eyes steady, serious. "I notice now." Later, as dusk folded the sky into purples and golds, Elijah walked into the cabin carrying something wrapped in flannel. "I've been holding on to this," he said. He set it on the table and gently pulled back the cloth. Inside was a carved wooden box, its corners rounded from years of being handled. He opened it. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, was a thin iron ring, modest, unfinished, but clearly made by hand. "I made it a long time ago," he said. "Didn't know what I was waiting for." Clara approached slowly. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "This isn't about owing," he replied. "It's about naming what's already here." He didn't kneel. He didn't rehearse a speech. He simply held it out to her, and she didn't hesitate. She took the ring, held it for a heartbeat, then slipped it onto her finger. It fit. Not perfectly, but like it belonged. That night, Clara placed her old suitcase at the edge of the room. Then she opened it. For the first time, she folded the last of her traveling clothes and placed them into a drawer beside Elijah's worn flannel shirts. And when she blew out the lamp, the last thing she saw was the soft glint of iron on her hand, resting gently over the quilt they now shared. A week later, they rode into town together, side by side on horseback. No longer strangers, no longer halves waiting to be made whole. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Willow Junction wasn't the kind of place where anything went unseen. But this time, the whispers were different. Not cruel, not curious, just quiet acknowledgments of something that had settled, something real. At the general store, Mary greeted them with a wide smile. "Thought you two might come in today," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ledger's been waiting." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Ledger?" Mary tapped the thick book behind the counter. "Most couples add both names when they start buying under one roof. Some folks wait for a ring. Some don't bother. But names say what mouths sometimes won't." Clara glanced at Elijah. He gave the smallest nod. Mary opened the ledger, handed Clara the pen. The page was already halfway filled with scrawled signatures from other families. Coleman, Maddox, Harrow. Clara pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. Then, in clean, slow strokes, she wrote, "Clarabelle Boone." She handed the pen to Elijah. He didn't add a second name. He simply drew a straight, steady line beside hers. A signature without ceremony, but a vow just the same. Outside, they lingered by the horses before mounting again. "You all right?" Elijah asked, watching her trace the curve of the saddle absent-mindedly. Clara nodded. "I never thought I'd change my name again." He waited. She continued. "First time I did it, I lost parts of myself. Quietly, without noticing. This time," she looked up at him. "This time I chose." Elijah reached for her hand. Careful, not claiming, and she gave it freely. They rode home with their names written down in ink and dust and sun. And that night, Clara carved something small into the post by the door. Not her full name. Not his. Just C and E inside a rough heart. The kind a child might scratch on a tree. Elijah found it the next morning. He didn't say a word, but his fingers lingered over the carving longer than necessary, as if memorizing every groove. From that day on, their supplies were delivered in paper sacks marked Boone, and no one, not in town, not on the trail, ever questioned again whether she belonged. Because she did. Not because she wore a ring, not because her name was written in the book, but because she stayed, and because someone, quiet as the wind, steady as the land, had waited for her long enough to make space where there'd once only been silence. By late spring, the land turned green with promise. Wildflowers colored the hillside, bees traced lazy loops through the garden rows, and the air smelled of rain long before the clouds arrived. It was the kind of season that whispered of new life, second chances, and roots sinking deep, both in soil and in hearts. But no place, no matter how warm, is free from storms. And theirs came one gray afternoon. It began with a letter. A rider brought it to the edge of the property. A stranger on a lean bay horse, looking apologetic before he'd even spoken. "You Clarabelle?" he asked. She stepped out from the porch, drying her hands on her apron. "I am." He handed over the envelope, tipped his hat, and rode off without another word. She stood frozen for a moment, envelope trembling slightly in her hand. Elijah came around from the barn, saw her stillness, and walked to her side. "Something wrong?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. Inside, she sat at the table, Elijah beside her, as she opened the letter. It was from her sister, a sister who hadn't written in years. The words were formal, careful, but under them ran a thread of expectation. "I've heard you married. Is it true? Please write back. I'd like to visit, if you'll have me. There are things I'd rather say in person than put on paper. Margaret. Clara read it twice, then folded it neatly. She always had good timing, she murmured. Do you want her to come? Elijah asked gently. I'm not sure, Clara said. Part of me wants to see her face. Another part remembers all the ways she once looked past me. Elijah waited. Clara stood, paced once around the room, then stopped in front of the hearth. She left me alone after Father died. Never asked where I went. Never sent word whenever it passed. Elijah rose slowly, crossed the room, and stood behind her, not touching, just near. You don't owe her anything, he said. But maybe you owe yourself the choice to say so. Clara turned, eyes glossy but calm. You'd be all right if she came? Elijah nodded. It's your home, too. The letter went out 2 days later. Clara's response was brief. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She simply wrote, You're welcome to see what I've built, and sent it. Margaret arrived a week later, stepping off the same platform Clara had once waited on, her bonnet stiff and her shoes too polished for prairie dust. She looked at Elijah first, stoic, sunbrowned, quiet. Then Clara, confident, steady, standing tall in a blue dress Margaret had never seen. Well, Margaret said, you're not what I expected. No, Clara replied. I'm not who I used to be. The visit wasn't easy. Old wounds surfaced. Pride. Misunderstandings that had hardened into assumptions. At one point, Margaret said, You've settled for a small life. And Clara answered, without flinching, No, I finally chose one. On the last day, Margaret stood by her horse, holding the tin of cornbread Clara had packed for her. This place suits you, she said quietly. He suits you. Clara nodded. I know. I don't think I would have stayed. You never had to, Clara said, but I did. They hugged, awkwardly, gently. Then Margaret left, and the storm passed. Not loud, not violent, just necessary. That night, Elijah stood with Clara at the edge of the porch, watching the wind pick up the scent of lilac and earth. You all right? He asked. She leaned into him. More than all right. He nodded, then whispered, You don't run from hard things. She smiled. Not anymore. And above them, clouds moved gently across the sky, empty now, having given up all they held. The kind of sky that follows after rain. Clean, quiet, ready. Summer unfolded gently, like a story that no longer needed to rush toward a climax. The cabin breathed easily now, windows open, curtains swaying, boots lined neatly by the door. Clara planted herbs in tin buckets along the porch steps, and Elijah built a swing that creaked just enough to make the evenings feel alive. They didn't talk about the future in grand declarations. They just lived it. Each day they stayed, the past lost a little more of its grip. One morning, Clara found a note on the kitchen table in Elijah's careful, spare handwriting. Gone to the West Ridge, back before dusk, don't wait supper. She smiled, folded the note, and tucked it into the apron she now wore most days without thinking. She'd begun keeping all his notes in a small wooden box near the hearth. There weren't many words in them, but enough to build a whole life around. She opened the door and stood for a moment in the light. The air smelled of wildflowers and sun-warmed pine. The land looked back at her like it knew she belonged. And she did, fully now, without the need to say it aloud. That evening, Elijah didn't come back by dusk. Clara set a plate for him anyway. Bread, beans, a bit of honey on the side. She wasn't worried. Not truly. Not yet. But as the sun slipped beneath the ridge and the shadows stretched longer, she did something she hadn't done since the night she arrived. She lit the lantern on the porch, and she left the door open. Not out of fear, out of faith. Because sometimes a porch light isn't for the lost. It's for the found, for the one who already knows the way home. He returned just before full dark, a little dustier than usual, carrying a sack over his shoulder and a branch tucked behind one ear. Clara stood on the porch, arms crossed, her mouth twitching at the corners. You took your time, she said. Wasn't hurrying, he replied. She stepped forward, brushing dust from his sleeve. What's this? She asked, tapping the branch. Peach tree, he said. Bare root. Traded with the Miles family for 2 saddle buckles and a jar of your strawberry preserves. She blinked. You bartered jam for a tree? He shrugged. Figured you'd want something permanent. Something that gives fruit when it's ready. Not rushed. Just rooted. Clara reached up, pulled the branch from behind his ear, and held it between them like a promise. You gonna plant it? He nodded. Tomorrow. Together? He met her eyes. That's the only way I do things now. They planted it the next morning, just beyond the garden, where the soil was soft and the sun lingered longest. Clara stood barefoot, her skirt damp with dew, and Elijah dug while she held the slender trunk steady. No one spoke. The moment didn't need words. When they finished, she pressed her palm to the earth and whispered, Grow slow, grow true. That night, the porch light stayed off, not because no one needed it, but because everyone was home. And when Elijah reached for her hand beneath the table, Clara didn't flinch. She just laced her fingers through his and held on. Not to survive, but to stay. Autumn came quietly. The air sharpened, the light softened, and the land began to sigh. Leaves curled, gold and rust. Mornings arrived with a breath of frost, not enough to harden the ground, but enough to wake the bones. Clara added an extra quilt to the bed, one she'd been stitching slowly through the summer months. Each square cut from something worn and remembered. Elijah's old shirt, her blue dress trimmings, scraps from Jonah's hand-me-down apron, gifted by Mary from town. It wasn't a fancy quilt, but it was warm. It was theirs. One evening, as Elijah split wood for winter, Clara stood in the doorway watching the sky pale. Something about the wind felt different, like it carried a question. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, the one she hadn't worn since spring, and waited until he looked up. "You ever think about the future?" she asked. Elijah set the axe aside, leaned on the handle. "Some," he answered. "I used to be afraid of it," Clara admitted. "Now I think it might just be the next page." He smiled. "You think in books? I think in seasons." "Do they tell you the same thing?" "They tell me," he said, walking toward her, "that the storm season's short, but the soil's better after it passes." She laughed, soft and breathless, as he stepped onto the porch. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We keep planting." That Sunday, the town gathered for harvest service. A potluck, a hymn, and long tables filled with squash, honey, and cornbread. Clara wore her blue dress and brought 3 pies. Elijah brought himself, which the town accepted just fine. At the end of the meal, Mary tugged Clara aside. "We're adding names to the bell," she said. Clara blinked. "The chapel bell?" Mary nodded. "It's tradition here. One name for every union built in faith. No ceremony needed, just intention." She held out a small slip of paper and a pencil. "Only if you want to." Clara stared at it for a moment, then slowly wrote, "Elijah and Clara Boone." She folded the paper, tucked it into Mary's hand, and smiled. "It's time." 2 weeks later, the bell rang. Not loud, not showy. Just once, just enough. From their porch, Clara and Elijah heard it as they shelled peas beside the fire. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. But Clara reached for his hand beneath the table and laced her fingers through his, and he squeezed once, firm and certain. They were no longer waiting. Not for storms to pass, not for papers or promises, not for someone to knock and offer them something better. They had built what they needed with weathered wood and honest silence. And when the wind turned colder, the fire inside held. That night, as they climbed into bed, Clara tugged the quilt over them, her fingers brushing each square like memories. "Elijah? That bell. It didn't sound like the beginning of something." "No?" She rested her head against his shoulder. "It sounded like a seal, like something finished becoming." He placed his hand over hers. It did. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a lullaby. Inside, the house breathed in rhythm with 2 people who had finally come to rest. Not because the world had made it easy, but because they had chosen, again and again, to stay. The first snow came early that year. It dusted the fields in silence, blanketing the high grass and softening every edge. From the porch, Clara watched as flakes gathered on the window ledge and melted against the warm glass, leaving behind tiny, perfect traces. Inside, Elijah sat by the hearth, shaping a piece of maple with a small, whittling knife. His hands worked slowly, methodically, as if the wood already knew what it wanted to become. Clara carried 2 mugs of warm cider and placed one beside him. "What are you making?" she asked. He tilted the carving toward her. It was a bird, small, sturdy, with wings just beginning to stretch. "It's not done," he murmured. She sat beside him on the rug. "It looks like it's ready to fly." He smiled faintly, eyes never leaving the grain. "That's the hard part, knowing when to stop shaping and just let it be." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She got up, lit a single lamp, and opened her journal, a habit she'd picked up again. Words flowed easier now, no longer filled with ache, but with details of days well lived. He fixed the barn door today, said it was creaking like a widow at a prayer meeting. I caught him staring at the quilt when he thought I wasn't looking. He says more in his silence than most men do in a lifetime. She paused, then wrote, "Maybe love isn't loud. Maybe it's in the hands that keep showing up, in the way the fire's always tended, in how he carves the bird to fly but never tells it to." A few days later, the children from town came by, nieces and nephews of neighbors, bright-eyed and red-nosed from sledding down the old trail. Clara made cookies, and Elijah brought out a tin of small wooden toys he'd crafted during the quiet weeks of summer. One of the girls, A curly-haired thing named Lottie held up the bird he'd just finished. "Does it fly?" she asked. Elijah knelt beside her. "It does," he said softly. "Just not the way you think." And he placed it gently into her mittened hands. That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "You know," she said, "I used to believe the only men who could protect you were the ones who raised their voices." Filled up the room, took up all the space. Elijah didn't speak. He simply laced his fingers through hers, patient as always. She turned to look at him. "But then I met a man who didn't raise his voice. He raised me." Elijah blinked once, the corners of his mouth lifting the smallest bit. She whispered, "You're the gentlest thing that ever happened to me." He leaned in, forehead against hers, his voice a low promise. "And I'll keep happening to you, every day you let me." Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the warmth never flickered, and love in all its quiet strength carved something lasting. Not in words, but in the softest spaces of two hearts that had finally found their rhythm. The days shortened. Nights came earlier now, curling around the cabin like a thick wool blanket. The scent of pine smoke lingered in the rafters, and Clara had taken to warming the bed with a hot brick wrapped in cloth before Elijah climbed in. It was a small thing, but he never failed to smile when he found it. Life was slow, but never still. They woke with the sun, chopped wood, cooked meals, and read beside the fire. Clara had taught Elijah how to play checkers, and he, in turn, had taught her how to recognize animal tracks in the snow. Peace had taken root, which made what came next all the more jarring. The letter arrived by stagecoach, unexpected and tightly folded, sealed with a stamp Clara recognized instantly, her past, from a town she hadn't thought about in months. It wasn't from Margaret. It wasn't from a friend. It was from Everett's brother. She read the name on the envelope twice before bringing it inside. "Elijah," she said, her voice a little thinner than usual. He looked up from the hearth, catching her unease instantly. "What is it?" She held it out. He didn't press, didn't ask questions. Just nodded once and waited nearby while she opened it. The letter was short. "Clara, word traveled late. I just heard of Everett's passing. There are still some of his things left at the house. I didn't know if you wanted any of it. If not, I'll clear it myself. I'm sorry we weren't better family. John." Clara sat down slowly. Her breath caught. Not in sorrow, not quite, but in the tug of something unfinished. Like a book she'd placed face down and left too long on the shelf. She hadn't thought about Everett's belongings. His coat, the ring, a box of letters she'd once written and never sent. Did she want to go back? Did she need to? That evening, Elijah didn't ask for an answer, but he laid out the travel blanket on the trunk at the end of the bed, just in case. 3 days later, Clara stood once more in front of the home she'd once shared with a man she didn't mourn, but had once loved in a way she barely remembered now. The house was smaller than she recalled. Doustier, quieter. John let her in and gave her time. No lectures, no judgment. In the attic, she found a tin box. Inside were photos. One of her on their wedding day, smiling faintly. Distant, even then. A handkerchief she had embroidered. A letter in Everett's handwriting, addressed but never mailed. She read it. Twice. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't warm either. "I don't know how to reach you anymore. Maybe I never did. But I think I tried, Clara. I think I did. And if I didn't say it before I left, I'm sorry." She folded the letter gently, placed it back inside the tin, and closed the lid. Then she stood and walked away. Outside, Elijah waited by the fence, reins in hand. When he saw her, he didn't ask what she'd found. He simply held out his gloved hand. She took it, and they rode home. That night, she placed the tin on a shelf high in the closet. Not to hide, but to rest. Then she sat beside Elijah on the porch, where the stars blinked down cold and bright. "It's strange," she murmured, "how something can hurt and heal in the same moment." Elijah turned to her, voice quiet. "You went back for a piece of yourself." She leaned into his shoulder. "No," she whispered. "I went back to bury the last of someone I used to be." And with that, the wind shifted, carrying not memories but the promise of new ones. Winter deepened. The land slowed its breath. The snow thickened like frosting across the ridges, and the creek behind the house froze in place, mid-murmur, like it had paused just to listen. Clara and Elijah adjusted to the quiet the season brought. Mornings were for stoking the fire, afternoons for mending things, evenings for sitting close, sometimes in conversation, sometimes in silence that felt more intimate than speech. But the stillness did not last, because one night, just as Clara was extinguishing the lamp, a flash of orange glowed in the distance through the window, then another. Elijah was already pulling on his boots before she could ask. "The woodshed," he said, "and it's spreading fast." They ran, Elijah first, Clara behind him, grabbing a bucket and the small pump canister. The fire hadn't come from within. It had been lit, a lantern broken on the edge of the woodpile, glass and kerosene, deliberate. "Elijah!" she shouted over the crackling. He nodded grimly. "Just the shed so far. Keep the house wet." They worked fast, tossing snow, dragging buckets from the pump, beating sparks from the air with wet burlap. The children stayed inside, the older ones keeping the younger calm with stories, like Clara had taught them. After an hour, it was over. The shed was lost. But the house was safe. So were they. They stood in the cold ash, breath steaming into the dark. Elijah's face was lined with sweat and soot. Clara touched his arm. "This wasn't an accident." "No," he said. "Someone came here." "Do you think it was about you or about me?" He looked at her, steady, calm, unmoved by fear. "Doesn't matter." She took a breath. "We should tell the sheriff." "We will." Then he turned and added, "But first we rebuild. Not because we have to, because we don't run." The next morning, Clara went out and saw the ruins. Black wood, melted iron hinges, the faint scent of smoke still in the air. And then she saw it. One thing had survived. The carved wooden bird Elijah had made for Lottie. It lay in the snow, scorched on one side, wings untouched. She picked it up, cradled it in her palm. Somehow it still felt warm. By noon, neighbors arrived. Word had traveled fast. Not out of gossip, but out of care. They came with tools, with planks, with pies. Clara stood in the doorway, stunned. Mary wrapped her in a thick scarf and said, "You're not alone anymore, Clara. You're one of us." Together they raised a new shed by sundown. Smaller, sturdier, and at its center beam, carved carefully, was a single word Elijah had pressed into the wood. "Stay." That night, the family gathered around the fire inside. The storm hadn't broken them. It had revealed them. Elijah sat close. The children curled up with blankets, and Clara brought out her journal. She read aloud for the first time. About grief, about starting over, about the night the fire came, and how it took only wood. Not hope, not home, not love. Outside, the wind moved gently past the cabin. Not a threat, just a reminder that a fire may come, but it cannot burn what's been earned. The days after the fire settled into a rhythm again, one slightly altered, like a familiar tune played in a different key. The new woodshed stood strong against the cold, its timber smelling fresh and proud, and neighbors still dropped by with more than tools now, with friendship, with laughter, with hands ready for whatever came next. Clara found herself humming more as she worked. And Elijah? He was drawing again, not carving this time, but sketching on scraps of parchment, ideas for a greenhouse he'd seen once as a boy, back east. "A head start on spring," he explained, tapping the side of his temple. "Just in case you want tomatoes in April." She smiled. He was always thinking ahead, always making room for something new to grow, even after the fire, especially after the fire. Then one morning, Clara awoke to a silence too perfect to ignore. She pushed open the cabin door and gasped. The snow had come in the night, deeper than any before. It blanketed the ground in layers so thick and smooth it looked untouched by the world. And across the surface of it, just a few feet from the front porch, were footprints. Only two. "Coming in, not going out." She turned. "Elijah!" He was already pulling on his coat, rifle slung over his shoulder. Not in panic, but in practice. "Stay inside," he said. She nodded, but not before placing a hand over his on the doorknob. "Be safe." Elijah followed the tracks into the tree line, each print careful and human, not rushed. Whoever it was had come slowly, deliberately. The trail led toward the ridge and stopped near a low outcrop of rock. No one was there, but wedged under a stone, Elijah found a small scrap of paper. A message scrawled in rough handwriting. "I was never looking to hurt you. She just got a second chance. Not everyone does. You got a good woman. Keep her warm." Elijah stared at the note for a long moment, wind tugging at the edge of his coat. Then he folded it, tucked it into his pocket, and walked home. He said nothing to Clara when he returned, but that evening he added another log to the fire, and when he sat beside her, she leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "Is it over?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled the scrap from his coat and handed it to her. She read it, and something in her chest loosened. "It's strange," she said, "how mercy sometimes shows up in muddy boots and cold hands." "Or in letting things go," he added. She looked at him. "Are you afraid?" "No." "Why?" He turned toward her, his eyes steady, his voice low. "Because we've already survived the hardest parts. The parts before each other." Outside, the snow began again. But this time, Clara didn't watch it with worry. She watched it fall over the new shed, the stacked wood, the carved word "stay" just visible beneath the eaves, and she smiled. Because whoever had left that message, they were already walking away. And whoever had stayed, They were holding hands beneath the same roof, by the same fire, in a house made of second chances and thick walls of grace. The snow melted slow that year. It pulled back like an old curtain, hesitant at first, then all at once, revealing patches of green that had waited patiently beneath months of white. Clara noticed it first beneath the windowsill, the tiny buds of wild violets pushing up through thawed earth like quiet promises. Elijah built the frame for the greenhouse in early March. By the end of April, it stood behind the cabin, glass panels shimmering like a lantern in the morning sun, wooden beams sturdy and straight as his back when he worked. Clara filled it with everything she'd once dreamed of, but never dared ask for. Tomatoes, mint, early beans, a single small rose bush she nursed like a secret, and in the center, a little wooden stool for her to sit, while the world bloomed around her. On one golden afternoon, Clara stood in the greenhouse, brushing her fingers gently across a tomato vine when a voice called from the porch, "Mama!" It was Jonah. He ran across the yard, cheeks flushed, holding something in his hand. "What is it?" Clara asked, crouching. He held it out, a small silver ring, dull with age, simple in design. "Found it by the tree line," he said, "buried under the snow." Clara took it carefully. It was her old wedding ring, the one she'd thrown into the woods the day she realized Everett wasn't coming back. She stared at it, the cold metal warming slowly in her hand. Then gently she stood and turned toward the cabin. Elijah was at the workbench when she came in. He looked up, sensing something in her expression. She walked over and held out the ring. "I let it go once," she said softly. "But now that it's come back to me, I think I'd rather give it away." He tilted his head. "To who?" "To the man who taught me that love can be quiet, gentle, that it can show up late and still be right on time." Elijah blinked once. Clara took his hand and slid the ring, not on his finger but into his palm. A gesture. A vow. No preacher, no paper, just the truth of it, resting there between their fingers. He closed his hand around it, then around hers. That night they danced in the kitchen. No music, just the rhythm of two people who had found their way through cold seasons and long silences. Elijah led, unsure but willing. Clara followed, sure but patient, and the floorboards creaked beneath them like an old song being remembered. At one point he whispered, "I'm not much for dancing." "You're doing just fine," she said. "You showed up." Later, in the greenhouse, Clara sat on the little stool and wrote in her journal, "Spring didn't knock. It just let itself in. It didn't ask if we were ready. It bloomed anyway. And so did we." She closed the book and leaned her head back, watching the vines stretch toward the glass ceiling, toward the sky, toward everything ahead. Summer came like an exhale. The creek flowed strong again. Children splashed barefoot on its muddy banks, and the cabin, once a place of waiting and uncertainty, now rang daily with laughter, footfalls, and the crackling of warm bread crusts in the oven. Elijah had built a swing for the little ones. Jonah helped him with the rope. Abby named it Cloud Rider. And Clara? Clara wrote more now. Not to escape, but to remember. Pages filled quickly, no longer with sorrow, but with moments that mattered. The smell of pine after rain. The way Elijah hummed when he carved. The simple holiness of watching her children sleep safe under a roof no longer haunted by fear. One afternoon, while gathering eggs, Clara heard the familiar creak of Elijah's cartwheels turning into the yard. But something was different this time. There was a sign in the back. Hand-carved, smoothed, sanded, painted with care. He unloaded it gently, almost shyly, as the children ran to see. Clara approached, wiping flour from her hands. "What's this?" Elijah set the sign against the fence. It read, "The Holloways." She froze. The name, hers once, hers again. But this time, it stood not for what she had endured. It stood for what she had chosen. Elijah scratched the back of his neck. "I know it's not quite official, but it's honest." Clara stepped forward, brushing her fingers over the letters. It was honest. More than that, it was home. She looked at him. Quiet, steady Elijah, with eyes like dusk and hands always building something, and whispered, "I never thought I'd belong to anything again." He replied without hesitation, "You don't belong to anything, Clara. You belong with us." They hung the sign together, just above the gate, while Jonah held the hammer and Abby supervised with all the authority of a 7-year-old. Neighbors stopped by that week and noticed the sign. Some smiled, some asked questions, and some nodded like they'd always known this would happen, like fate had simply waited for two people to stop surviving and start living. That evening, as the sun folded itself gently behind the hills, Clara sat on the porch, watching the shadows stretch across the grass. Elijah brought her a blanket and sat beside her. She looked toward the gate, toward the name. and felt no ache in her chest, no questions, no echoes, just stillness, and the soft certainty of being kept. In her journal that night, she wrote, "I never imagined that a name could feel like shelter, but now it does. And maybe love isn't the thunder. Maybe it's the fence post you lean against at dusk, with someone beside you who doesn't need to speak to make you feel known." Autumn came in quiet steps. Leaves turned amber and gold, brushing softly against the wind like they knew not to disturb what had finally settled. The air smelled of earth and apples, and the mornings began with breath visible in the cold light, and ended with blankets shared near the fire. The children were growing fast. Jonah asked more questions now. About tools, about crops, about how to tell when someone meant their promises. Abby wrote her name in the dirt beside the porch every morning, watching it wash away with the afternoon rain, and writing it again the next day, like she needed to keep reminding the earth she was here. And little Ruth? She toddled from lap to lap, hands always sticky with jam or curiosity. Clara looked at them one morning and whispered to Elijah, "They're so full of now. They don't know how hard before was." He nodded. "That's how you know we did it right." That fall, the town hosted its first harvest dance since the war ended. There was music in the air, warm cider in tin mugs, and lanterns swinging from every tree in the square. The whole town showed up, and for once, there was no gossip, just smiles, calloused hands, and a shared sense of getting through things. Clara stood to the side, watching the girls twirl. Elijah leaned beside her, quiet as ever. "You ever dance?" she asked. He shrugged. "Only when no one's watching." "Then let's give them a reason to look away." They danced. Slow at first. Awkward. She stepped on his toe. He chuckled. But then they found the rhythm. Not of the song, but of each other. And in that square, under flickering light and leaves caught mid-fall, they swayed in a circle of people they once thought would never know them. But they did now, because they had stayed. They had chosen each other, and it had been enough. More than enough. That night, back at the cabin, Clara put the children to bed and stepped onto the porch alone for a moment. The stars were out. The wind was soft. And somewhere behind her, Elijah moved in the kitchen, humming a song she couldn't name, but always recognized. She opened her journal for the last time and wrote, "He never promised me the world, just a place inside it, and somehow that became everything. Forever wasn't loud. It was the way he always looked back to make sure I was close. It was the chair he fixed before I even asked. It was the fire, already lit, each time I came in from the cold." She closed the journal and left it on the windowsill, where the morning light could find it.